This video, it's going to be about a few things that I've done over the past few days. You know, I've been busy, so I've just worked on the car a little here and a little there. I picked up some transmission cooler lines, so there will be a little bit in there about that. I went through the distributor and got that back setting in the motor just so that I don't get dirt in the motor. And a little bit of a rant, complaining, which I usually don't like to do on my channel, but you know, sometimes parts can be aggravating. So in getting the engine and the transmission ready to reinstall, once I get all the engine compartment and everything done up, I ordered a new vacuum advance for the distributor. That one, it works, but it's the original 53-year-old advance, and how much longer is it going to work before the diaphragm ruptures? And it kind of looks bad, and you can't get a new one that looks just like this, so this will stay with the box of parts from the car. Whoever buys it will get that with the car. The new one just looks, you know, like the modern one's, a little nipple. That's the original vacuum hose with the white tracer, and I think this car is about as original as you can get. I think some of the hoses have been replaced at one time. And I don't think the trans fluid had ever been changed. Probably not the rear axle lube. I might pull axle shafts in the diff carrier and clean that out and put new gear oil in it. You know, just check the carrier, the diff pig out. We'll see. But anyway, I got a new one of those coming, and it won't look exactly like that. That's just, I cannot find one exactly like that. They just don't exist anymore. And I did put the new oil sender in there finally, and I put the new modulator in the transmission, and I might just unscrew that and screw the old one back in when I paint it. So I'm going to clean the surface and bolt the pan back on, and then I'm going to bead blast a bunch of the brackets and stuff so I can shoot a bunch of black at the same. When I mix up the black, I'm going to spray that with the same type of paint I painted the engine with, acrylic enamel. And I might as well paint all the brackets and the fan blade and pulleys and stuff. And that's where this ramp part will come in. I'll show you here in a minute. So I was going through the alternator to decide what I was going to do with it. And I was going to take it apart so I could repaint this piece black and bead blast and repaint the fan pulley. But as you can see, can you see that? That pulley is all rusted out. And it's still, you know, this car sat parked. I don't think a lot of people remember or realize this car sat parked for 43 years. And there's belts still stuck in the pulley, and I can't get that. I've taken a screwdriver and tried to pry that out and tap that out with a hammer. I think that it's just bound in there and kind of adhered. And so I need to replace this fan pulley. And I thought, well, you know, I'd put new bearings in the alternator too. I did take it to a local auto parts that could spin it on a tester, alternator tester, that still has one of those ancient machines, and it actually works. It charges, and it's really not noisy. I could probably get away with just putting a new fan pulley on it and reusing it. Now, typically alternators, original equipment alternators, somewhere had the amperage and, you know, whatnot stamped into them, and I cleaned the case off a little bit, and I can see some remnants of some numbers right in here. Maybe I can't make anything out. I tried to clean that up the best I can, and I just can't make anything out. But I think that this might be, that's the way the alternator would have been on the engine. So this, I think, would have went down and this up. Maybe I'm not really sure. I don't remember. But so I was looking in here, and I kind of wire brushed the whole alternator to see if I could see any numbers on it, and no numbers exist on it. So I'm going to say that is the original style alternator, but whether it was replaced or not, I can't say. I don't know if that's the OEM factory installed alternator or not, because I can't find any numbers on it. And So anyway, I found one identical to it online, remanufactured. Showed the case curved here in the back. The pulley, all the stuff looked correct. So I ordered it. It was $38 including tax and shipping. I thought, I have nothing to lose. Until I got the alternator today. And this is the replacement alternator. Sharp corners, curved. The pulley looks about the same diameter, same, so I contacted them to see if they can get, I said the picture you had online of the alternator looked like this. I told them, and I said, and the alternator you sent me looks nothing like it. And I want to either send it back for a refund or send it back and exchange it for an alternator that looks like this. Well, I probably won't hear from them. And if I don't, $38 isn't, bank breaking. And you can see where this was remanufactured. So it's garbage. And so what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to use the housing off this alternator and the innards of this alternator and the pulley from this alternator. So that way the alternator looks correct on the car. I can clean this housing up to look like brand new. And you can see when they rebuild alternators, they sandblast it with, I think, quite a coarse abrasive. It leaves that aluminum quite rough. And the original aluminum isn't rough like that. So I am going to try and, like I say, if you can't send me an alternator that looks just like this, then I'm just going to tear this one apart and tear this one apart. And between the two, I'll have a good alternator. Like I say, this one did charge when it was tested, so maybe I can just put bearings and rob that pulley off of it. It's kind of an expensive pulley, $38 for just a alternator pulley. But this one is beyond using, so I have, the option of trying to find an alternator pulley and just sending that one back and putting another pulley and bearings in this one, or like I say, switching the innards. But being that this is made in China, the quality isn't going to be near as good as this one. I doubt this alternator will last like this alternator has. And so that's just a little bit of, part of, you always run into fiascos like this when you work on cars, these older cars. If you're trying to do things to original, it's 10 times more work than if you're just doing whatever. If I was just kind of, if I was putting AutoZone chrome on the engine and, chrome thermostat housing and valve covers and air cleaner and Eldbrack manifold and carburetor and headers, who would care if the alternator's not correct or not? It wouldn't matter. But when you do cars completely factory original, you need to do them completely factory original and have the original looking. If they're not the original component, at least the original looking, a period correct part on the car. And this is not period correct looking on that. That won't look right on that car. Anyone that knows these cars will look at, oh, that's a replacement alternator. Well, that's not going on the car, I'll tell you that right now. I don't care what. I am not putting this on the car. So don't worry, it's going to have an alternator of this style, even if it means this one going back on and robbing the $38 pulley off this one. We'll see. When we get to that step, I know I can make a good alternator and a good starter. I found I have a starter drive. I have a whole box of starter drives. So between those two starters, I can make a good starter. I'm not worried about that one bit. But this is the kind of stuff that's annoying when you ask a question about something online. Is it identical to the alternator in the photo? And they say yeah, and then you buy it and you get it and it's not. That's what I find extremely aggravating. So we'll see what comes about with this alternator. If I can exchange it for the correct one, I'll, correct looking style, I'll put it on. If not, we'll go through this alternator. So I picked up some transmission cooler lines at a place called Inline Tube in Shelby Township. I'll give you a little view of it here in a second. This is the place right here. It's 15066 Technology Drive. Shelby Township, Michigan. Pretty nice to be able to go locally and get my parts. Not only is it made in the United States, it's made in Michigan. So we're not very far off Hayes. We're like maybe south of 23 Mile Road, about 3/4 of a mile, and just off of Hayes. So this is like 23 and Hayes that we're at. Picked up a cheap thin wrench that fits in between there to change the vacuum modulator. So that is now changed. And I'll show you where I got a little bit about the cooler lines. I believe I did show the replacement transmission cooler lines. They even came with those little clips. So this is where I got the tubing from. It's called inline tubing. They have brake parts, brake tubing, parking brake cables, disc brake kits, you name it. That's what I got. They had them advertised for the 65, 66, so C6 and the C4, but they didn't for the cruise-o-matic. So I took my lines, the old lines, and went there, and they held them up to their bending fixture, and they're exactly the same as the ones for the C6, so that's what I got. So with tax, yeah, it was 58 bucks. And I've been cleaning up the distributor, trying to get all the crud off of it. And I took the breaker plate out just because it would make it easier to clean up. Breaker plate, vacuum advance, those were the little screws hold the breaker plate on, the long screws hold the vacuum advance on. That little clip right there holds that to the breaker plate. I don't know if I forgot to mention this or not, but there is a little fiber piece down in below the rotor. You take the rotor off and you'll see a little piece. Put a few drops of oil on that. That lubricates their centrifugal advance. This turns, I don't know if you can see, but it turns on that shaft, and if that seizes up, then you won't have any centrifugal advance. So it's important on Fords to keep that little wick under the rotor, a few drops of oil on it, you know, every time you do a tune-up or so. But centrifugal advance looks in good shape. I think good cleaning of the distributor, and it'll be ready to go back in the motor. It turns nice and free. I'm not going to take the shaft out. It's just not, there's zero wear in it, and this thing's in, I mean, look at that. No side-to-side, no end, the side-to-side play, and the end play is right on specifications. I actually checked it. So we'll just finish cleaning this up, and then I'll throw it back together and throw it in the engine to help keep the engine clean. Then I can take it out when I install the engine. So I just put the distributor in just to help try and keep the engine clean. Just sitting there. So I made a mark on the distributor where the #1 spark plug wire goes. The timing is at TDC #1. So the rotor is pointing at the #1 terminal. The vacuum advance pretty much all shoots straight out according to the shop manual. And we'll put, you know, I'll be taking that back out to set the motor in, and then I'll set it back in. But if I turn the motor, it'll stay in time. You know, I can just put a new mark on the distributor wherever I stop turning it. So now I'm just gonna clean this up, clean the parting surface up, and put the sump back on, get this ready for paint. Yeah, the fluid in this did look dirty, you know, I mean, but the bottom of the sump wasn't really caked with crud, and I think the transmission will be fine. You know, transmission fluid, I don't know if a lot of people realize it, but it goes bad over time. Like gasoline, it literally varnishes and goes bad. And that was probably the original fluid in this transmission. I doubt that the fluid had ever been changed in it. That's one thing most people neglect in their cars, is the transmissions and the rear axles. It's like they might get the engine oil changed, you know, on a regular basis, or, you know, when the book recommends it, which often isn't often enough. But then they forget that the car has a transmission and an axle, and they need to be taken care of too. You can kind of see how I propped the transmission is kind of hanging so it's down, and then I just hold this up with one hand and take my razor knife and scrape the gasket off with the other. And I got pretty much all the gasket across the, just to take it off down there, and I'll stand the transmission back up to do that, and then I'll clean things up and get the sump back on. Okay, so I got the parting surface all cleaned up and everything looks, see if I can get some light in the thing here. Everything looks really good in there anyway. It's nice and clean. Alright, do this much the same as the valve covers. I just open up the vise a little bit, take the bolting hammer, and tap the bolt holes back down in. If you don't do this, it doesn't seal between here because these are tight up against your metal parting surface, and then these aren't, and then they leak in between the pan and the ground. So anyway, I'm going to pound those out. I'm not going to video them all. The sump is all nice and clean. I gave this side a quick metal etch prime. I think this sump was originally natural, just left bare metal, and that's why it was all surface rusted. And I just don't want surface rust under the car, so it is going to get painted black. I'm not going to paint it, so it would look funny painted silver, I think, you know, to try and make it look natural. I think it would just look better painted with the rest of the transmission, so I'm going to install it and paint it on the transmission. These are what I'm going to bead blast to get ready to paint when I paint the transmission. I'm going to paint the water pump, bead blast it and paint it, and if I don't find another one I'll just reuse it. That's the power steering, alternator, and radiator support, and the bolts, which I'll bead blast. And I'm going to clean up the cross member and paint that too. The black paint still on it. This is what I used for the vacuum on my shop vac, and it stays pretty clean. I mean, I clean that once every 2 or 3 times. I replace this bag. This is a drywall dust bag, and that really saves the vacuum cleaner. If I didn't use this, I'd be replacing this vacuum cleaner all the time. And I'll show you what that stuff looks like that's in the bag. All this vacuum is used for is the bead blast cabinet. Look at that. That's just like flour in there. So that is the dust from the glass beads breaking up, and that is pretty full. And so, you know, I lose suction when these fill up. So I just, when the dust isn't clearing out, I change the bag here. Now it's more legible. Got the sump pan on, and the torque spec for the bolts is 10 to 13 pounds, and I do everything by the shop manual. Try and set everything, make sure everything's right at factory specs. Usually don't have any issues. So I went around the sump about 4 times, torquing it until the socket doesn't turn anymore and you get the click. And that way you know that the gasket's evenly smushed all the way around. And I think this will be my last time around the case. And I started with that bolt, so I'm going to call that good. That tag is the assembly date of the transmission. You can see the actual casting date is April 12th, 66. And it was assembled on April 26, 66. And this car rolled off the assembly line on April 29th, 66. Okay, so I'm going to get all the other brackets ready for paint, and we'll get this painted and all those brackets at the same time. In the meantime, I can work on other things on the car. It's kind of nasty out. I'll probably take this outside to spray it so I don't have to cover everything up in the garage. Just a little, makes life a lot easier to do that. It's easy enough to move around. And same with the brackets. I can just stand out there and hold them hanging from a wire spray and bring them in, hang them in here back on the stand so I can push it around the garage and not get anything in it. I had the torque converter out while I was standing up, and I had a little pan there that was catching what was dripping out of the front of the transmission. Really need to get a strap instead of that, you know, like a ratchet strap instead of that Mickey Mouse chain. But at least I can move it around the garage on that. I'm going to clean up the dipstick tube, put it back on, put a couple of the cooler lines back on. Because I get so frustrated with the poor fit of parts, you know, the quality of reproduction parts is just not there. So this cooler line was rotten where the little clip that held it to the engine was. Both lines were rotten here, and this one just finally gave out, fell apart. But this would have been down here like so. And so I put the new cooler lines on the transmission momentarily, and they're exact, pretty much all an exact fit, so I think that I will be okay with them. They're actually made in the US, made right here in Michigan. Alright, so I got the transmission together enough, sealed up to where it won't get dirt in it. I pinched off the original cooler lines that I just threaded on there to keep crud out, and put the torque converter back in. I think I said that though. And I think I'll leave this assembly together, the bell housing on, until after I paint it, because I can stand it on the end like it was sitting on that cardboard to spray it, to paint the cast iron part. And then when I go to put the transmission in the car, I'll separate the bell housing from the transmission, and I'll put the seals in, seal. I'll bolt that to the engine with the torque converter, flywheel, all that good stuff. Get the engine in, then I can put the transmission in, and I think it'll be a lot easier with that attached to the engine from this, you know, separated. So that's kind of what I will do when I get ready to, you know, install it. And you know, I've been making progress. We got a ton of, that box is full of most of the old engine parts, the old water pump, old motor mounts, old fuel pump. You know, I've been saving old parts for some odd reason. I may throw the motor mounts and the fuel pump away. I don't know. We'll see. But just, you know, if the next owner of the car eventually, when I sell it, wants to see the parts, see what kind of wear, you know, what was on them, they can. That's nothing to do with the Galaxie. That was part of a prototype program. There's parts in there from a GM turbine engine, which is like a smaller version of the Chrysler turbine that was used in the 64 turbine car. Actually, the engine physically looks the same, just smaller version of it. GM was prototyping and, you know, experimenting with one in the 80s, and that's what is in that box, is parts from that. So that's kind of what's going on here. Anyway, that's about the end of this video. I'm going to call it a day. And just to let you know, Dad, I'm using the GoPro camera that you gave me. My dad didn't use his GoPro much at all, so he gave it to me, and I'm putting it to use. So thank you, Dad. And this is it. So if you like my videos, hit the like button. If you want to see this awesome Galaxie resurrected, subscribe to my channel. And thank you for watching my videos.